June 4th, 1942, 500 miles northwest of Midway Atoll. Vice Admiral Chuichi Nagumo stood on the bridge of the aircraft carrier Akagi, the flagship of the most powerful naval strike force on planet Earth. He was 55 years old. He had commanded the same fleet that had destroyed the American battleship line at Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier. His four fleet carriers, Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, carried 248 aircraft, the elite of the Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service, the same pilots who had sunk the British battleships off Malaya, who had wrecked the Royal Navy in the Indian Ocean, who had not lost a major engagement in the entire Pacific War. Nagumo's mission that morning was to neutralize the American air base on Midway Island, to draw the last surviving American aircraft carriers into the open ocean, and to finish the work Pearl Harbor had begun. He believed those American carriers were thousands of miles away. He had been told this by his own intelligence service. He had been told this by the staff of Admiral Yamamoto, the architect of Pearl Harbor and the man who had spent 6 weeks planning this operation in detail, by every information stream available to the Imperial Japanese Navy in May of 1942. The American carriers were either in the South Pacific, licking their wounds from the Battle of the Coral Sea, or were simply gone, sunk in actions Yamamoto's intelligence officers had counted as confirmed. The pilot of the first Japanese strike returned to Akagi at 0830 with bad news. The American base at Midway had been less damaged than expected. A second strike would be needed. And then, at 0920, a Japanese reconnaissance pilot named Amari, flying a float plane from the cruiser Tone, made a transmission that should have been impossible. He reported sighting an American carrier task force 200 miles to the northeast. Nagumo did not believe it. He could not believe it, because if it was true, it meant that the United States Navy had known he was coming. It meant that the American carriers had been positioned deliberately to ambush him. It meant that someone, somewhere, in some basement, had broken the Imperial Navy's main operational code, the code Yamamoto's signal officers had personally assured him was mathematically unbreakable. Nagumo did not know it that morning. He would not know it for 3 more years, until the war was over and he himself was dead. But the man who had put the American carriers exactly where they needed to be on the morning of June 4th, 1942, was not an admiral. He was not a general. He was not even a member of the Imperial Japanese Navy or the United States Navy in any conventional sense. He was a 42-year-old U.S. Navy officer named Joseph John Rochefort, working in a windowless basement room with no air conditioning, 14 hours a day, in a converted administrative building on the second floor of Building 1 at Pearl Harbor. He was wearing carpet slippers because his feet hurt. He was wrapped in a smoking jacket because the basement was cold. He had not slept in his own bed in 7 weeks. He had cracked Yamamoto's code, and at the moment Vice Admiral Nagumo's reconnaissance pilot was filing the report that would end the Imperial Japanese Navy as a strategic force, Joseph Rochefort, 6,000 miles away in his cramped basement office, was already asleep on a cot, having stayed awake for 38 straight hours, waiting for the news to come in. Part 1. The code that could not be broken. To understand how a former enlisted sailor with no high school diploma ended up doing what every German cryptanalyst, every British intelligence officer, and every Japanese counterintelligence specialist would have called impossible, we have to go back. Not to the morning of June 4th, 1942, but to a Japanese naval headquarters in Tokyo in 1939. The Imperial Japanese Navy was, by any rational measure of the time, the most professionally secured naval communications system on the planet. Its main operational code, designated by American cryptanalysts as JN25, was a 5-digit additive cipher of breathtaking complexity. Every Japanese naval message was first translated into a 5-digit number drawn from a code book of approximately 33,000 entries. That 5-digit number was then encrypted a second time by adding to it another 5-digit number drawn from a separate book of additives. The resulting 10-digit string was what went out on the radio. To break a single Japanese naval message, an enemy cryptanalyst would have to recover both the codebook entry and the additive used to encrypt it. The Japanese changed the additive book regularly. They changed the code book itself periodically. The mathematical permutations involved meant that, by the calculations of the Imperial Navy's own communications branch, even a continuous attack on JN-25 by the world's most skilled cryptanalysts would require, at minimum, several decades to produce useful intelligence. They were correct in theory. They were correct in pure mathematics. They were entirely wrong in one single particular. They had not accounted for what would happen if a small group of Americans, working in a basement with index cards and IBM tabulating machines, simply refused to stop looking. The first systematic American attack on the precursor of JN-25 began in 1939 in a small unit inside the Office of Naval Communications in Washington called OP-20G. Its director was a quiet career officer named Captain Lawrence Safford, who had been doing cryptanalytic work on and off since the early 1920s. Safford understood something that the Imperial Japanese Navy did not. He understood that human beings, even highly disciplined human beings working under wartime security, leak information. They reuse phrases. They send weather reports at the same time every day. They follow templates. They append routine signatures. Every routine introduces what cryptanalysts call a crib, a piece of plain text whose existence in the message can be inferred even before the cipher is broken. And cribs, painstakingly assembled, give the cryptanalyst the foothold he needs to start unraveling the code. By 1940, Safford's team had begun to read fragments of Japanese naval traffic. Not entire messages, not consistently, but fragments. Word groupings, geographic references, ship names. By the spring of 1941, when Safford was sending his best people to forward stations in the Pacific to expand the attack, the man he chose to lead the listening post at Pearl Harbor was a 41-year-old commander whose service record was not what the Naval Academy graduates around him would have called distinguished. Joseph Rochefort had no college degree. He had quit high school in 1917 to enlist in the Navy. He had been an enlisted sailor before he was an officer, what the regular Navy called a Mustang, a man promoted up from the deck plates, rather than commissioned through Annapolis. He had been recommended for cryptanalytic training in 1925 because a senior officer had noticed that Rochefort spent his off-duty hours solving crossword puzzles, and that he was, by reputation, one of the finest auction bridge players in the Pacific Fleet. Those two skills, puzzle solving and high-level card play, turned out to be more relevant to breaking enemy codes than any academic credential the regular Navy could have offered. Rochefort had spent 3 years in Japan from 1929 to 1932, living with his wife and son in Tokyo, learning the language, reading the newspapers, studying the way Japanese officers thought. He came back to the United States with one of the deepest practical knowledges of Japan possessed by any American naval officer of his era. By the time Safford sent him to Pearl Harbor in June of 1941 to take command of the listening station designated Station Hypo, the H standing for Hawaii in the Navy's phonetic alphabet of the period, Rochefort was both a trained cryptanalyst and a fluent Japanese linguist with 9 years of service experience reading Japanese culture from the inside. He was, in other words, exactly the right man for the job that was about to fall on him. He was also, by the cultural standards of the Naval Academy Officer Corps that ran the United States Navy in 1941, the wrong man. He was an outsider. He had no graduation ring from Annapolis. He had a habit of telling senior officers, in plain language, when their assessments of Japanese intentions were wrong. He called incompetent superiors clowns and stuffed shirts, sometimes in their hearing. He had a sense of humor that the regular Navy considered unofficer-like. None of those things mattered to the man who was placed in Pearl Harbor in June of 1941 to do a job. They mattered enormously a year later when Rochefort had done that job and was standing in the way of certain men in Washington who wanted the credit. We will come back to that. But first we have to talk about December 7th, 1941, because Pearl Harbor was Rochefort's catastrophe before it was anyone else's. Part 2. The Basement and the Burden. Pearl Harbor, December 7th, 1941. By the time the second wave of Japanese aircraft was finishing its work over Battleship Row, Joseph Rochefort was already in the basement of Building 1 at the 14th Naval District, surrounded by the men who would become the most consequential intelligence team in American military history. He had not predicted the attack. Nobody in his unit had predicted the attack. Nobody in OP-20G in Washington had predicted the attack. Station Hypo, in those months before Pearl Harbor, had been focused on tracking Japanese fleet movements through traffic analysis and partial decryptions, and the Japanese fleet that attacked Pearl Harbor had observed what cryptanalysts call radio silence. It had not transmitted. There had been nothing to read. Rochefort would carry the guilt of that failure with him for the rest of his life. By every account of every man who worked under him, including those given decades later in the carefully recorded oral histories collected by the United States Naval Institute, Joseph Rochefort blamed himself personally for not having seen Pearl Harbor coming. He had nothing to blame himself for. The information needed to predict the attack had not been available to anyone, but he was the kind of man who, given a job, would consider himself responsible for everything that happened on his watch, whether the failure had been preventable or not. He moved into the basement in the days after the attack and, for all practical purposes, did not leave it again for 7 months. He worked in carpet slippers because standing in regulation shoes for 14 hours hurt his feet. He wore a quilted smoking jacket over his uniform because the basement was constantly cold from the air conditioning needed to keep the IBM tabulating machines from overheating. He slept on a cot in his office 2 or 3 nights a week. He ate his meals at his desk. His wife, Elma, who was at home with their 2 children in Honolulu, saw him perhaps once every 10 days. The men who worked for him followed his example. There were about 30 of them at the start of 1942. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, the chief cryptanalyst, who would later be called by his peers the finest cryptanalyst the United States Navy ever produced. Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, a former submarine officer who had been retired for medical reasons before the war and brought back as a traffic analyst. Major Alva Bryan Laswell, a Marine Corps officer who, like Rochefort, had spent years in Japan studying the language. Lieutenant Commander Edwin Layton, technically Rochefort's superior in his role as Fleet Intelligence Officer to Admiral Husband Kimmel and then to Admiral Chester Nimitz, but in practice his closest friend and the man who would carry Rochefort's analysis directly to the commander of the entire Pacific Fleet, Yeoman Durwood Rory, Lieutenant John Williams, Chief Yeoman Farnsley Woodward. The basement crew that would, in 5 months, do what the Imperial Japanese Navy had been told was mathematically impossible. The work they were doing in those months can be described in plain language, but it should not be misunderstood. They were taking encrypted radio traffic, between 50 and 140 messages a day, depending on operational tempo, running it through partial decryption based on what was known of JN-25, comparing the results against everything else they knew about Japanese fleet dispositions, current operations, and previous communications, and producing what cryptanalysts call best guess interpretations. A message that came in might read, in raw form, as a string of 5-digit groups, perhaps 50 groups long. Of those 50 groups, the team might have recovered the meaning of 10 or 12 from previous work. 3 or 4 more might be guessable from context. The remainder would be unknown. Rochefort and his team would produce a translated message that read, in effect, something like this. The IJN auxiliary unknown will proceed to AF on date approximately X, carrying load type Y, for purpose unknown. They would then ask themselves, what is AF? What is the load? What is the date? What is the purpose? And they would compare that fragment against the previous 10,000 fragments they had recovered, looking for patterns. This was painstaking work. It was in many ways work more like archaeology than mathematics. You did not solve JN-25. You excavated it, one shard at a time, and you reconstructed the picture from the shards. By April of 1942, the Rochefort team was reading approximately 10 to 15% of the volume of Japanese naval traffic. Not full decryptions, fragmentary glimpses. But fragmentary glimpses, accumulated and analyzed by a man who had spent 3 years living in Tokyo and who could read between the lines of Japanese naval thinking, the way most Americans could read English, were beginning to assemble themselves into a picture. And in the last week of April of 1942, the picture started to show something that nobody at OP-20G in Washington wanted to believe. Part 3. AF. The first reference to AF appeared in JN-25 traffic in the second half of April 1942. It was a code group used in operational orders that referred to a target. Rochefort's team had seen geographic code groups before. Most Japanese major cities and naval bases had 2-letter or 3-letter geographic designators. Yokohama was OH, Tokyo was OK, Hawaii was AH. The Aleutian Islands were AO. The pattern in the code groups was not subtle. Almost all Pacific geographic designators began with the letter A. The exception that mattered was the second letter. AH was Hawaii. AF was something else. Something in the Central Pacific. Something Yamamoto was preparing to attack with what the traffic analysis showed was a massive concentration of carriers, transports, and supporting units. By April 30th, Rochefort had concluded that AF was Midway Atoll, the small American naval base approximately 1,150 miles northwest of Hawaii. The reasoning was straightforward. AF was clearly in the Central Pacific. The volume and composition of forces being directed toward AF in the intercepted traffic indicated a major operation, not a raid. Midway was the only meaningful American outpost in the Central Pacific west of Hawaii. The geography fit. The capability requirements fit. The timing, late May or early June 1942, fit Yamamoto's strategic problem of needing to draw the surviving American carriers into a battle before American shipyards could replace them. By every available measure, AF had to be Midway. The problem was that OP-20G in Washington disagreed. Captain Safford, who had recommended Rochefort and trusted him, had been replaced as the head of OP-20G in February of 1942 by Commander John Redmond, an officer with a background in communications administration rather than cryptanalysis. Redmond's brother was the head of naval communications. Their advancement by the standards of the Naval Academy Officer Corps was tracking. Redmond believed, and his analysts in Washington supported him in believing, that the next Japanese attack would not be in the Central Pacific. They thought it would be in the Aleutian Islands or in the South Pacific, or possibly directly against the west coast of the United States. They thought Rochefort, sitting in his basement in Pearl Harbor, was overinterpreting fragmentary intelligence and that his AF equals Midway hypothesis was wishful thinking. Admiral Ernest King, the chief of naval operations and the most powerful man in the United States Navy, sided with OP-20G against Rochefort. Admiral Chester Nimitz, the commander of the Pacific Fleet, sided with Rochefort. The reason Nimitz sided with Rochefort and the reason the entire course of the war in the Pacific was about to be decided in his favor was a simple and very old-fashioned one. Nimitz had been listening to Rochefort through Edwin Layton for 5 months almost every day. He had heard Rochefort's reasoning. He had seen Rochefort be right repeatedly about smaller operations earlier in 1942. He had developed what military men of his generation called confidence in the source, and he was prepared to bet the entire remaining strength of the United States Pacific Fleet on Rochefort's word. But before he could bet his fleet, he needed to be certain. And so, in early May of 1942, in a small office in the Pearl Harbor basement that smelled of stale coffee and old paper and the particular metallic odor of overheated tabulating machines, Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes proposed an idea that would become one of the most quietly elegant pieces of operational deception in the history of military intelligence. Holmes proposed that the United States Navy send a deliberately false message, in the clear, with no encryption, from Midway Atoll to Pearl Harbor. The message would say that the freshwater distillation system on Midway had broken down and that the garrison was running short of drinking water. If AF was Midway, the Japanese would intercept that message, would assume it was real American operational traffic, and would relay the information to their own attacking force, instructing them to bring extra water for the assault. If AF was not Midway, nothing would happen. Nimitz approved the deception. The message was sent. Within 48 hours, Station Hypo intercepted a Japanese transmission in JN-25, reporting that AF was running short of water and that attacking units should adjust their water provisioning accordingly. AF was Midway. The case was closed. Nimitz did not wait to be told this twice. He immediately began moving the three operational American carriers, USS Enterprise, USS Hornet, and USS Yorktown, the last patched together in 72 hours from the damage she had suffered 3 weeks earlier in the Battle of the Coral Sea, to a position northeast of Midway, where they would lie in ambush for the Japanese strike force that was already, by late May, steaming east from the inland sea of Japan. Rochefort had given Nimitz the date. He had given him the place. He had given him, with remarkable accuracy, the size and composition of the attacking force. Nimitz did the rest. If you have made it this far into this video, hit the like button. The men in the Pearl Harbor basement, Rochefort and Dyer and Holmes and Laswell and Layton and the rest, are mostly forgotten by the country they served. Almost none of them ever received the recognition their work deserved. Joseph Rochefort spent the rest of his life refusing interviews, refusing to discuss his role, refusing to take credit for what he had done. He was, his daughter Janet said, in the only interview she ever gave about her father, a man who believed the work was its own reward. Every like on this video keeps his name and the names of his team alive for a few more people. That matters more than they ever asked for. If your father or grandfather served in the Pacific, in the Navy, in the Marines, on a carrier, on a destroyer, in a submarine, in any of the roles that depended on the intelligence Rochefort's team produced in the months between Pearl Harbor and the end of 1942, drop their name in the comments. What unit, what ship, where they served. The men in the basement made the men at the front possible. Both deserve to be remembered. Now we have to talk about what happened on June 4th. Part 4. The morning. 500 miles northwest of Midway. June 4th, 1942. 0420 hours. Vice Admiral Nagumo gave the order to launch the first strike against Midway Island. 108 aircraft, the cream of the Imperial Naval Air Service, took off from Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu, heading southeast toward the small American base they had been sent to neutralize. Nagumo had committed approximately half of his available aircraft to the Midway strike. He was holding the other half in reserve, armed with armor-piercing bombs and torpedoes to use against any American surface ships his reconnaissance might find. He was not expecting to find any. By 700, the first strike was hitting Midway. By 800, the strike leader, Lieutenant Joichi Tomonaga, had reported back to Akagi that a second strike would be needed, that ground installations had been damaged but not destroyed, and that American aircraft from Midway were already counterattacking the Japanese carriers. Nagumo made a decision that, by every conventional standard of carrier warfare, was the correct decision. He ordered the reserve aircraft, the ones armed with torpedoes for use against ships, to be rearmed with high explosive bombs for a second strike against the island. The crews of Akagi, Kaga, Soryu, and Hiryu began the laborious process of striking torpedoes from the planes, hauling them down to the magazines, hauling up bombs, mounting them, and refueling. This work in 1942 carrier operations took approximately 90 minutes. At 0728, the Japanese reconnaissance pilot from the cruiser Tone, named Amari, flying the float plane that had been launched late because of a faulty catapult, reported sighting an American surface force. He did not at first identify it as containing carriers. He reported what looked like cruisers and destroyers. Nagumo was now in a tactical position that the Imperial Japanese Naval War College had spent years training officers to avoid. He had half his aircraft armed with the wrong weapons for the threat in front of him. He had to choose. Continue rearming for a second Midway strike, in which case he would be defenseless against any carrier that might be present in the American force. Or stop the rearming, leave bombs lying loose on the hangar decks of all four carriers, and rearm again with torpedoes. He chose, after a delay of approximately 40 minutes that historians would argue about for the next 80 years, to begin the process of switching back. At 0820, Amari amended his report. The American force did contain at least one aircraft carrier. By that point, an American strike of approximately 150 aircraft, launched from Enterprise, Hornet, and Yorktown, was already in the air. Nagumo did not know it. He could not see them. He had only the partial information his reconnaissance was giving him. But the American carriers had launched on the basis of the position information Rochefort had given Nimitz, almost an hour before any Japanese pilot had even reported their presence. The American attack arrived in fragments. The torpedo bomber squadrons came in first, low, slow, and almost suicidally exposed. Torpedo Squadron 8 from the Hornet, 15 aircraft, was wiped out almost to the man. Of the 30 crewmen who flew off the Hornet that morning, 29 died over the carrier task force they had been sent to attack. One man survived, an ensign named George Gay, who would float in the water for hours and watch the rest of the battle unfold from his life vest. The Japanese fighter screen, the Zero Combat Air Patrol that had wiped out Torpedo 8, was now low on the water. The high cover above Akagi, Kaga, and Soryu was thin. And at 10:22, 3 squadrons of American Dauntless dive bombers from Enterprise and Yorktown, having flown for hours through bad weather and low fuel and uncertain navigation, arrived overhead at exactly the moment when the Japanese fighters were too low to intercept and the carriers were too encumbered with rearming aircraft and exposed bombs to maneuver effectively. In the next 6 minutes, between 1022 and 1028, 3 Japanese fleet carriers were hit, broke into uncontrollable fires, and effectively ceased to exist as combat platforms. Akagi took 2 bomb hits and would be scuttled the following morning. Kaga took 4 to 5 hits, exploded internally, and sank that afternoon. Soryu took 3 hits and sank within hours. Hiryu, separated from the other 3 when the dive bombers arrived, would survive until evening, would launch 2 strikes that crippled Yorktown, and would then be hit and sunk by the next American attack. By the morning of June 5th, all 4 Japanese fleet carriers that had attacked Pearl Harbor 6 months earlier were on the bottom of the Central Pacific. Approximately 3,000 experienced Japanese sailors and aviators, including a quarter of the carrier-qualified pilots in the entire Imperial Japanese Naval Air Service, were dead. The Imperial Japanese Navy, which had not lost a major engagement in any war in its modern history, would never recover from this single morning. Yamamoto's strategic plan, the plan to draw the American carriers out and finish them, had instead drawn the Japanese carriers out and lost them. And the man who had made it possible was, at the moment the dive bombers were arriving over Akagi, asleep in a basement in Pearl Harbor on a cot, having stayed up for the previous 2 nights, waiting for confirmation that the trap had worked. Part 5. The Reward. There is a way that an honest country in possession of a man who has just won a war ought to treat that man. It ought to honor him. It ought to give him recognition. It ought to put him in a position where his particular gifts can be used to maximum advantage in the conflict that remains. The United States Navy of 1942 did none of those things to Joseph Rochefort. It did the opposite. The campaign to remove Rochefort from Pearl Harbor began within weeks of Midway. It was conducted by Commander John Redmond and his brother Captain Joseph Redmond at OP-20G in Washington. Their argument, made internally and never publicly, was that Rochefort had been operating outside the chain of command, that he had been reporting directly to Nimitz rather than routing his analysis through Washington, and that the Battle of Midway had revealed an organizational anomaly that needed to be corrected. The truth was simpler and uglier. Rochefort had been right. They had been wrong. He had reported directly to a fleet commander who had trusted him over them, and that commander, on the strength of his analysis, had won the most decisive naval victory in American history. They could not forgive him for it. Admiral Nimitz, recognizing what Rochefort had done, recommended him for the Distinguished Service Medal in July of 1942. The recommendation went up the chain. It was killed quietly in Washington by Admiral Ernest King's Chief of Staff, Captain Russell Wilson, on the grounds that intelligence work was not the kind of operational achievement that warranted a DSM. In November of 1942, Rochefort was relieved of his command at Station Haipo and assigned to the routine task of supervising the construction of a floating dry dock in San Francisco. He was 42 years old. He had broken Yamamoto's code. He had just been told that his services as a cryptanalyst were no longer required. He served the rest of the war in a series of administrative posts. First the floating dry dock, then the Pacific Strategic Intelligence Section starting in 1944, where he did good work but never again held an operational role anything like the one he had held at Pearl Harbor. He retired from the Navy in 1953 at the rank of captain. He went home to live in Torrance, California. He gave no interviews. He wrote no memoir. He talked, when he talked at all, only with old shipmates from Haipo and with his children, and never about the work itself. The men who had served under him spent 40 years trying to get him the recognition he had been denied. The campaign was led, in the late 1970s and early 1980s, by Rear Admiral Donald Max Showers, who had been a young lieutenant in the basement in 1942 and who by then was a senior member of the American intelligence community. Showers and a small group of Haipo veterans wrote letters, lobbied congressmen, contacted the office of every Secretary of the Navy who would receive them. They were turned down repeatedly on the grounds that the original DSM recommendation had been considered and rejected, and that the Navy did not reopen such matters. In 1985, the Reagan administration finally agreed to revisit the case. On November 10, 1986, 10 years after Joseph Rochefort had died at the age of 76 in his home in Torrance, his daughter Janet and his son Joseph Jr. stood in the East Room of the White House while President Ronald Reagan presented the Distinguished Service Medal posthumously to the family. Janet was 61. She had been a small girl in Honolulu in the years her father almost never came home from his basement office. Joseph Jr. was a few years younger. He had been an infant during the war. The medal, sitting in a velvet-lined case, was handed to them on behalf of a man who had been dead for a decade. The citation, written by the United States Navy, said that Captain Rochefort's work had been, quote, of inestimable value to the Pacific Fleet, end quote. 6 words that summarized what he had done in 1942 and what it had cost his country to take 44 years to admit it. In 2012, the United States Navy named a building at the National Security Agency facility at Joint Base Pearl Harbor-Hickam after him. The building stands close to where his basement office had been 70 years earlier. There is a plaque inside the lobby. His grandchildren visited it the year it opened. They told a Navy public affairs officer that he would have hated the attention, that he was the kind of man who had walked away from the work, who had refused to discuss it, who had insisted, every time anyone tried to give him credit, that the team had done it, and that he had only been one piece of the team. They were right about him. They were also right about the team. There were 35 men in that basement at Pearl Harbor in May of 1942. Most of their names are not in the history books. Lieutenant Commander Thomas Dyer, the chief cryptanalyst, the man whose mathematical work cracked the inner mechanisms of JN-25, died in 1985 with a small obituary in the local Honolulu paper that mentioned his Navy service, but did not say what he had actually done. Lieutenant Commander Jasper Holmes, the man who proposed the water deception, became a popular novelist after the war under the pen name Alec Hudson and a professor of engineering at the University of Hawaii. He died in 1986. He almost never discussed his role. Major Alva Bryan Laswell, the Marine Corps linguist, lived a quiet life in Texas and died in 1988. None of them received Distinguished Service Medals. None of them ever asked for one. They had done the work, they had won the battle, and they had gone home. That was the bargain. Verdict. So here is the answer to the question Vice Admiral Nagumo could not answer on the bridge of Akagi at 0728 on the morning of June 4th, 1942. How did the Americans know? They knew because a 42-year-old former enlisted sailor with no high school diploma had spent 8 months in a basement in Pearl Harbor in carpet slippers and a smoking jacket, doing the work nobody else could do. They knew because his 35 men, working 12 to 14 hours a day, had pulled meaning out of fragments of Japanese radio traffic the Imperial Navy had been told were mathematically impossible to read. They knew because a senior commander, Chester Nimitz, had been willing to bet the surviving strength of the United States Pacific Fleet on the word of a man who had no academic credentials, no political backing, and no friends in Washington above his old direct supervisor, Captain Safford. They knew because the bureaucracy that should have recognized Rochefort and put him in charge of every cryptanalytic operation in the Navy instead spent the rest of the war trying to undo what he had achieved. And they knew because, in the end, none of those people in the basement were doing the work for credit or for promotion or for recognition. They were doing it because the war had asked them, and they had said yes, and they had gone into the basement and not come out until the work was done. This is the part of the Pacific War that does not appear on the monuments. There is no statue to Joseph Rochefort. There is no carrier named after him. The aircraft that struck Akagi and Kaga and Soryu and Hiryu are remembered correctly as the dive bombers that won the Battle of Midway. The pilots who flew them, McCluskey and Best and Leslie and the rest, are remembered correctly as the men whose 6 minutes over the Kido Butai changed the course of the war. The basement is not remembered. The basement is where the war was actually won. Joseph Rochefort knew this. He knew it for the rest of his life. He knew it on the morning of November 10th, 1986, when he was already 10 years dead and his daughter was standing in the White House holding a velvet box. He had said, in the only public statement he ever made about the work, made privately to a colleague in the late 1960s and recovered later by his biographer Elliot Carlson, that the basement crew had not been heroes. They had been, in his phrase, just men doing a job. Read that line again, because it is the truest sentence anyone said about the Pacific War from the American side. Just men doing a job. The Imperial Japanese Navy had been beaten by men who did not believe themselves to be heroes, who did not seek credit, who worked in carpet slippers in a basement and went home to their families when the work was done, who lost their hearing from the constant noise of the IBM machines, who lost their marriages from the hours, who lost, in some cases, their lives, and who, in the end, were not even publicly thanked by the country they had served. Vice Admiral Nagumo, who had stood on the bridge of Akagi that morning watching his force destroyed, would commit suicide on Saipan in July of 1944, 26 months later, when the Americans landed on the island his Imperial Navy had failed to defend. He never knew about Joseph Rochefort. He never knew about the basement. He died believing, as so many of his countrymen did, that he had been beaten by overwhelming American material superiority and by bad luck. He had not been beaten by either. He had been beaten by a man in carpet slippers, 6,000 miles away, who was already asleep on a cot when the trap closed. If this story stayed with you, hit that like button. It helps the work of these men reach the viewers who care about what really happened, not what got into the textbooks. Subscribe if you want the next chapter, because the men in the basement worked through the rest of the war, and what they did at Coral Sea, at the assassination of Yamamoto in April 1943, at the Marianas, at Leyte Gulf, is a story most Americans have never heard. Joseph Rochefort, Thomas Dyer, Jasper Holmes, Alva Laswell, Edwin Layton, Donald Mack Showers. They had names. They came from Dayton and Honolulu and Topeka and 100 other small American places. They worked in a basement that no longer exists in a building that has been rebuilt twice. They left almost no record of what they had done. Their country was slow to thank them. But they were the men who broke the code that could not be broken. And they did it in time. And they did it for nothing. And they deserve to be remembered. By name and by unit and by the work. By anyone who has ever wondered how a war that should have been lost in 1942 was, instead, quietly won.